This is Alexander Hamilton. Well, I'm not Alexander Hamilton, but this is the class on Alexander Hamilton on Monday, October 18th, 2021. All right. Did you all get, I think there are 4 things. Do you all have 4 things in front of you? I like the way you've arranged them. In fact, I think we're probably going to do it in just that order. Oh, actually, change that and that around. Good for you.
I need the other two.
The other dude? What don't you have?
The first 2 you passed out.
So here's what you should have. You should have one that says an outline of the Articles of Confederation. But you've already memorized that from American government, right?
Sure.
All right, good. You should have something that says regime analysis of the founding. You all have
I
that?
have that.
You should have something that says Monday, October 18th, the dates and text of the constitutional period.
I don't have that.
Act 2, you have that actually from American government. That's pretty close to it, but you can have it.
Oh, it's okay.
No, you take it. I killed a tree
Wait,
for
what's
you.
the other one I don't have?
What's the other one you don't have?
I have this one, I have that. Oh, no, I have it. Okay.
Good for you. First of all, you all see this. This is how I recommend that you take notes on Chernow's book. If you're looking at it, by the way, the reason I can't use the projector is if I do that, it'll turn off the camera. So, why, God, why? Wait, I'm taking attendance. Scanning. Scanning. Haven't you begun to suspect I'm an artificial life form? Yes, this is what artificial intelligence is like. We're doomed. My toaster has more artificial intelligence than I do. Anyway, if you're looking at this, this essentially kind of goes up to the end of chapter 11, but this is actually how I try to take notes on it, and this is how I recommend you do it. You don't have to read my handwriting, but you can see the 4 columns. The one is the dates. So roughly you've got a timeline established. And we turn, after we finish the Chernow book and some of the foundational documents of American life that Hamilton is responsible for, which is essentially what we're doing in this month of the class. Remember, what we're doing next is turning back to the musical Hamilton and using Miranda's own autobiography or biography of the construction of the play. We'll watch how he then put the play together, and we'll see the relationship between the work of art that we watched at the beginning of class and the actual life that unfolded as we're watching it unfold now. Does that make sense? And by the way I conceive the rest of the class to be, if you're looking on the schedule, is then if we have time, and if you look, I scheduled the watching of the great 1936 version of A Tale of Two Cities sometime later in the class. I might move that up because actually in the material today, by the way, we're starting what I like to call Act 2 of Hamilton's life. And the way I would describe the difference between Act 1, which is material on this stuff, really chapters 1 through 11 essentially, is Hamilton is born, his early and difficult life puts a stamp on his character and also reveals his genius. He comes to America, and that's where this account starts, by the way, in 1772, when he first comes to New York. And then really the story of Act 1 is how Hamilton becomes an American, and at the same time that America is becoming. Now you'd have to say that his personal story and the nation's story become interwoven at that point. That is to say, he gets caught up with it, and his developing identity as a human being starts to follow the development of America as a developing entity. But in Act 2, which really starts in some ways in 1785, although I've dated it with the beginning of 1787, then Hamilton's personal story becomes inseparable from America's story. Because as I've already suggested the last couple of classes, what you'll see, and especially my main point today and in the next couple of classes, is to help you see that America would not have existed without Alexander Hamilton. Now again, as I said before, there are 5 or 6 other people that you could say that of. Washington, obviously, and Adams and Jefferson, Franklin, and Madison, for instance. But there's no question that the two central figures that come to the fore for today and really for Wednesday are Madison and Hamilton. The Constitution is unthinkable without their efforts and without their contributions. So really for today and for Wednesday, the story of Hamilton and the story of America become fused with the foundation of America's core institutions. That's the story we're talking about today. And what I've asked you to do for your written assignments is to look at two of the critical ways that Hamilton had an impact on that process. The first, as you're going to see, and what we're going to do today is I'm going to finish up a little bit with the institutional framework, and I rewrote my regime analysis so that it was legible and coherent. Thank you for nodding, Madison. And then the second part of today's class is I want to walk you through the history up to the Constitutional Convention, and at the same time talk a little bit about the second, if you're looking at this chart, the second regime of the United States, which was from 1776 to 1789, the regime of the Articles of Confederation, America's first constitution. And then what we're really looking at then is the generation of America's third regime, the Constitution of the United States and Hamilton's role in it. But in order to make that a little bit clearer, I do want to take some time to introduce you to the second regime of the United States, the Articles of Confederation. And I assume that most of you have never read the Articles of Confederation. Well, now you have. In fact, what I'm going to do is come to your dorm rooms tonight, and we're going to have an all-night reading of the Articles of Confederation. You bring the popcorn.
Let's go.
We, or the snails. Never mind. Then, in the last part of today's class, I'm going to walk you through the Constitutional Convention. Now, I do this in American government. I've given this lecture all over the United States. I've taught it at Princeton several times. I've taught it in Washington, D.C. This is one of the specialties of my scholarly background is the Constitutional Convention. And so if you're looking, those are the notes for today. This occurs in two forms. An extended narrative. So everything I'm going to say is essentially written down, but the way I'm really going to conduct you through it, I have two pages which, and Peter, what do you know? I copied and stapled two of the same pages. So that means you can actually tear them apart and then read one for each eye and watch it and read it in stereo. But what I'm really going to walk you through using, and again, if I could use the projector, then life would be good. We'll just have to make do. Is the chartograph of I invented that word. Ce n'est pas un mot vraiment en anglais. I invented the word chartograph. So if you can take it back to France and you'll say, qu'est-ce que vous avez étudié donc en États-Unis? And you'll say, le nouveau mot, chartograph. Everyone say chartograph. You don't know what it's like to be me. And you probably don't want to. So,
Why did you staple a blank piece of paper to that?
just another dead tree. When I was in college, I was driving along a dark road and a tree ran out in front of me and totaled my car, so I've been the enemy of trees ever since. Je hais les arbres. Is that correct?
Say it again, please.
Je hais les arbres.
Je hais les arbres.
Je hais l'arbre. So the S is silent?
Yeah.
Oh, thank God. I hate trees. Is that correct? Okay. All right, good. Where were we? Oh, yeah. So, all right. So just take a look at this. Again, the way I recommend you taking notes is in these 4 columns, the date, which gives you a timeline, the chapter, and the core pages. Not every page, not everything, but it gives you at least a sense of where these things are located in Cherno's book. And then in the third one is the events of Hamilton's personal life, including, by the way, his major writings. And in the fourth one, the events in the larger life of America. So that will help you, for instance, if you're working on your PRQs. This is just a nice way of visually taking notes that actually organizes things in your mind for you, where especially you get a timeline and you get the sense of the connection between the personal events of Hamilton's life and the emerging life of the country. Is that clear? So you might want to take a look at that. Meanwhile, to finish up what I talked about on Friday, Take a look at this now. This is the comparogram. An autre nouveau mot. Another new word. A comparogram of the three regimes of the United States. And on Friday, we had kind of gotten through most of the original regime. So just to remind you, every political system, every constitution, regime, or polity has four elements or parts. A set of fundamental ideas that expresses the shared view of human nature and justice in that society. Governing institutions that embody those principles and structure power. That's really the foundational institutional life of the political system. Those institutions act and do policies and form the common life of the city or the political community as it tries to construct a common good. And last, it results in a culture, a way of life. And even if there are subcultures, like if you look at America today, we're an immigrant nation. We're composed of many different ethnic groups and many different regions. But there's nevertheless a kind of a common American way of life and view that comes from living under American institutions and being governed by American ideas. And of course, every nation, every political system, unless they're absolutely totalitarian, is also an ongoing debate. I mean, just because a nation has a set of shared institutions, like for instance, let me just give you a quick example that I use in my American government class. America is founded, our foundational idea is the notion of human equality and rights. That was adopted by the formal beginning of the country on July 4th, 1776. So America comes into being with a new set of principles and ideas. And the point in world history that this is this is the first time in world history that a nation adopts the idea of human equality as its guiding principle. And as you're going to see, that principle it's like yeast when bread. You add yeast to bread, and eventually the yeast begins to transform and shape the whole loaf. We're still in the 250th year of our existence, and still we're trying to become what our fundamental principles are. So, and my point I want to make is just because a nation has a set of shared principles and ideas, institutions and laws and way of life, doesn't mean that everyone in that nation agrees on it. Let me give you a quick example. The Declaration says that the core principle on which the nation is formed is the concept of natural rights. Here's the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. La Déclaration de l'Indépendance. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Didn't you have to memorize this in grade school or something? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They wrote all their S's like F's then. Pursuit of happiness. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And the paragraph goes on to say that whenever any governmental system becomes destructive of those rights, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish that system of government and replace it with a new one. So by the way, let me just make a point about 1776, the musical that you all fell in love with. Remember, the drama of 1776 kind of obscures the reality because Lee's resolution for independence, which was submitted on June 7th, was actually voted and accepted on June 2nd. Then they devoted the next 2 days of debating the Declaration and adopted the Declaration on July 4th. That's when the real drama over slavery occurred that is portrayed in that one song that the representative from Georgia sings, Edmund Rutledge, when he sings the Triangle Trade. What's the point I'm making here? In some ways, if it weren't for the Declaration of Independence, there would have been relatively little controversy. They could have declared independence. But the problem is they needed the Declaration. Why did they need the Declaration? And it has to do with the change between the first regime and the second regime. Just to remind you, what was the nature of the colonial regime, of the United Colonies? Remember, what was the core idea? The divine right of kings, aristocracy, which means, like every other nation that had ever existed on earth up till that point, it was founded on a notion of human inequality, that some human beings were superior to others and therefore deserved to rule others, and moreover, that certain kinds of human beings were either divinely inspired or divinely born, the royal line. So why did they need the Declaration? And my point you're going to see is the very fact that they needed the Declaration led to the terrible conflict over slavery that you saw. Why did they need the Declaration? Why did many people think that revolution or rebellion from the king was illegitimate?
They saw themselves as inferior to the king.
Yeah, if the king has a divine right to rule you, he might be a shit, and he might be terrible, he might be a tyrant, but he's still your divine ruler. Does that make sense? So why did they need the principles of the Declaration?
Justify their actions.
Yes, to make the revolution legitimate. That's why they needed the principle of rights, of equality. If everyone's equal, what happens to the notion of divine right? Yeah, what happens to the notion of aristocratic superiority? What happens to the notion of slavery? Now do you see why there's a kind of tragedy in the American founding. It adopted the principle of rights, which of course comes from where? Essentially from the great Enlightenment philosophers. From Thomas Hobbes, from John Locke, from Montesquieu, from Voltaire, from Rousseau. These great ideas of human equality, which were percolating in the European mind at that time, finally became encrusted in a particular nation in 1776. Then, of course, the second great revolution founded on Enlightenment ideas was in 1789. Qu'est-ce qui s'est passé?
The French Revolution.
That is correct. Do I feel a song coming on? I have no power over this. It depends on what you want.
Yeah, you do.
Okay.
There's one.
This is by Alan Sherman, who was a Jewish comedian in the 1960s who used to take popular songs and make fun of them by making Jewish parodies. So there was a great popular song called You Came the Wrong Way from St. Louis. It's a disappointed love song, so this is his version of it. Louis the 16th was the king of France in 1789. He was worse than Louis the 15th. He was worse than Louis the 16th. He was worse than Louis the 13th. He was the worst since Louis the First. King Louis was living like a king, but the people were living rotten. So the people, they started an uprising, which they called the French Revolution, and of course you remember their battle cry, which will never be forgotten. Went the wrong way, old King Louis. You made the population cry, because all you did was sit and pet with Marie Antoinette at your place at Versailles. And now the country's gone kerblooey. All right, let's note that.
No. What rhymes with kerblooey? I kind of want to know. What was the rhyme?
Wait. Now the country's gone kerblooey. We're putting you on the shelf, but then what else could you expect from a king in silk stockings and pink satin pants? And when the people had no bread, she said, let them eat cake. That was the French Revolution.
I don't think pink satin pants and kerblooey rhyme. You know, it was good. It was good.
You know, at least it's gratifying to know that there's a student in the class who's actually listening. All right, good. So the first two great revolutions in the modern world, where the principles of the Enlightenment actually became politically relevant. The American Revolution and then the French Revolution in 1789. Now, my point then is, do you see the tragedy then? And do you see why they had to have that debate about slavery? Because in order to justify the revolution against the king and to deny the principle of divine right, aristocratic inequality, they had to adopt the principle of rights and equality. And that's why, of course, what was the great irony? The very principles in which they were rebelling against the king also condemned the very foundation of slavery, which was part of an American institution, especially in the South. Does that make sense? And that's why there is an element of tragedy in the American founding. But you could say this is an element that has to do with the great transition between human inequality and human equality that is the promise of the Enlightenment. All right. So, and what we did on Friday, by the way, was to complete the regime analysis. So what were the ruling institutions of the first regime of the United States? The Crown, Parliament. We talked about the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The colonial legislatures, the royal governors appointed by the king, and also the Church of England, which was the established church in most of the colonies, but some of the other colonies had other chapters. What kinds of laws and policies? Religious enforcement. You actually, in almost all the colonies, for instance, you had to go to church or else you'd end up in jail. One of the most important laws passed during colonial times, and de Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville makes a great part of this, is the abolition of primogeniture. Primogeniture. What's primo mean? First, and geniture? Birth. The first born. In aristocratic societies, almost always the law of inheritance was primogeniture, which means what? The lands and the title.
Pass the firstborn.
And that meant, in other words, if you were a younger brother or sister, you were screwed, you had to do something else, which is one of the reasons why Hamilton's ancestors on his father's side had to leave Scotland, is because literally it was in. And what de Tocqueville points out is that even in colonial America, the Americans abolished primogeniture. And that meant now that all the children in the family inherited property. What effect does that have? He actually makes a lot of this. He says, from that point on, America was not going to be an aristocratic society, because neither title nor land stayed concentrated in a family, but circulated. He sees that as the beginning of the circulation of a commercial economy and private property in America. Marxists and socialists have always complained that socialism and Marxism had no resonance among the people of the United States, and de Tocqueville explained it. Because from the very beginning, we didn't have the same kind of social classes that you had in aristocracy, because wealth flowed freely. And if everyone could inherit some property, that meant that all of a sudden property ceased to be concentrated in one family or ruling families. Does that make sense? So that's a big change in America that starts in colonial times. But of course, as we saw in 1619, slavery was imported to the United States. And as de Tocqueville points out, the South was the only part of America that had anything like aristocratic estates in the form of plantations made possible by slave labor. So that was the kind of mix of laws. And then what kind of way of life did that mean? Well, we were essentially an agricultural nation with plantation slavery in the South, but commerce was beginning to circulate, and of course, the core aspect of American social life was religious community. That was the first regime of the United States. What happens at 3 a.m. on July 4th, 1776? A new regime comes into being with a new set of principles. And that means, if you look down the rest of the line, that started to shudder through all the political and social life of America. First of all the royal governors either resigned or had to flee. And then the first great institutional reform was the creation of the democratically elected state legislatures, now of the United States of America. It's true, about 6 of the states had property qualifications, but property qualifications are not the same thing as an aristocratic title. So what you see in American institutional life is this gradual filtering down of institutional equality, of the democratization. Really, by the time of the Revolution was over, you had nearly universal suffrage. And by the way, on this idea that you had to be white male, 21 years old to vote, that it was not universally true. New Jersey actually enfranchised women for the first part of the decade, from the 1790s. And free blacks could vote in all the northern states. So the idea that only white males could vote, that is not true. And by the way, the Democratic Revolution is complete in the Constitution, because if you look at the Constitution, which we did in my American government class, what shows that the idea of human equality is beginning to transform the institutional life of America. We're not going to go in detail into the Constitution, but here's an example. You might know this, I know Sammy knows it because I made her tattoo it on her thighs. What are the qualifications to be a member of the House of Representatives? Anybody know this? Under the Constitution. How old do you have to be?
30.
Nope.
40.
Nope. 25. How long do you have to live in the United States?
9 years?
7 years. And you have to live in the state. What about Senate? 30 years old. Live in the United States, be a citizen of the United States 9 years, and live in the state. President. 35 years. Now, to be president, you have to be what?
U.S. citizen by birth.
By birth. You have to be a natural born citizen, and you have to have lived in the country for 14 years beforehand. There aren't qualifications listed for the Supreme Court. And to be a voter in the United States, originally it was whoever could vote for the most populous and democratic legislature in the state. Now it is anyone over the age of 18. Think about this. There are no property qualifications, there's no gender restrictions, there's no racial restrictions in the Constitution. Technically, if you're born a human being on earth, you can occupy any part of American government with one exception: the presidency. That's about as democratic as it gets. Where did all that come from? It came from the fact that the regime's ideas changed and began to filter down and change the institutional life. And by the way, as you're going to see, what we're focusing on today is the change between the second regime of the United States, the Articles of Confederation, and the transformation to the Constitution, and especially Hamilton's role in that transformation. Again, if I may say for the 9 millionth time, Washington was indispensable for this, but the other two indispensable individuals in terms of not only the organization of the Constitutional Convention and its defense and structure, but also the intellect behind it were James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. They are in some ways the real founders of the Constitution of the United States, as I hope to make clear. So by the way, so what happened with the Declaration of Independence? Well, as I mentioned before, all the colonial legislatures became democratically elected state legislatures. One thing you'll see to understand the difference between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution is one of the things that strikes American government students when you look at the national government of the Articles is there was no executive branch and there was no judicial branch. If you've had American government, or if you haven't, you might understand why. Why didn't the creators of the new Constitution of the United States, the Articles, why didn't they put a national executive at the top?
They were afraid of them becoming too powerful.
Exactly. In some ways, the most negative model was the king, and they were afraid if they created a national executive. Of course, you're going to discover, and as Chernow points out, that's fine, except the nation, it turns out, needs an executive. In fact, if you see one thing from Hamilton's speech that I've asked you to write about, and from the papers, from the Federalist Papers on the presidency, what he shows is you can't have a government without an executive, without a vigorous executive. So, as you'll see, one of the great corrections between the Articles of Confederation is the creation of separation of powers on the national level, but especially a vigorous and strong, yet constitutional and restrained executive. That, by the way, that is Hamilton's greatest contribution to the constitutional system of the United States. And in some ways, the first time in human history where a powerful executive had been created that nevertheless was rooted in constitutional powers and also indirectly responsible to the people. That was a first in human history, and it is to that we owe Alexander Hamilton. So you can look at the rest of this regime analysis. I don't want to go over all of it. But for instance, once the revolution was passed, there was a broad democratization of American life. Suffrage spread to almost all classes, even again, New Jersey and women. Unfortunately, in 1798, they revoked suffrage for women. And by the way, probably the most important piece of legislation during the Articles period was the Northwest Ordinance. Chernow talks about that, but one of the critical things was the Northwest Ordinance forbade slavery above essentially what became the northern border of Missouri, and that became eventually a part of the Missouri Compromise. So anyway, you can look at my regime analysis. What we're examining today is the transition between this and that and Hamilton's role in it. Is that clear? Now, to get some sense then, look at what I did was I provided you with the text of the Articles of Confederation, and I don't want to read through it, although you can do that. What I did was I distilled it into its 13 articles. Why did they choose 13 articles for the Articles of Confederation? I wonder why.
13 colonies.
And 13 states. Actually, 13 stripes on the flag. Oh, never mind. You don't know what it's like to have been born a genius. All right, so the only thing I want to point out to you is the nature of the Confederation. It was a confederation, which meant what? It meant that the members of the Union, the United States of America, were not the American people. The analogy when I teach this in American government is almost all the nations of the world are members of the United Nations, correct? Does the United Nations govern you? Is the United Nations the government of the world? Why not? First of all, because we pay 1/4 of its budget. And second of all, generally speaking, when the United Nations passes a resolution, nobody pays attention to it. That's not always true. So, and by the way, setting the Security Council aside, no matter what the size, population, or power or wealth of the nation, how many votes does each nation get in the United Nations in the General Assembly? That means Liechtenstein and France and Germany, the United States, the People's Republic, and Russia are all equal to Monaco. You understand? You know what Monaco is? You know what Monaco is. Right? Monaco is about 8 miles wide. Have you ever been in Liechtenstein? Actually, a friend of mine in the Jewish community in Charlotte's from Liechtenstein, which makes her not only the only Jewish person I know from Liechtenstein, but the only person I know from Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein is about as large a country as Spartanburg. So they all have one vote, which means what? Each nation is equal to each other. That's what the states were in the Articles. And if you look at the Articles of Confederation, it says every power, every jurisdiction, every sovereignty resides with the states. And that meant essentially they recognized the necessity of a national government. But look at it. They gave it no real power. They couldn't pass taxes. The laws didn't operate on individual Americans. And one problem was there was no enforcement mechanism. It's interesting, if you look at the first and the last, the second clause and the 13th clause of the Articles, it says, this is a perpetual league of friendship. And it shall be observed. That's like my being your parents and asking you to clean up your room and then saying, you're you, right? And I'm your parents, right? Clean up your room, please. That's one situation. Here's another one. Clean up your room, or no allowance, no television, no food for a month. Which are you more likely to clean up your room? Now, it's not because your shits are not nice people, but if the only enforcement mechanism is pretty please, especially when it comes to political institutions, how effective a system do you think that's going to be? So in some ways, when you look at the Articles, this single national, no executive branch, no judicial branch on the national level, no real powers of governance, no powers of enforcement. You can see why, and this is where we're now going to turn to the history that leads up to the Constitutional Convention. You can see why, and by the way, when you look at the Articles, I made this point on Friday, essentially the Articles of Confederation was a perpetuation, a kind of a permanentization of the temporary institutions of the First and Second Continental Congress. Does that make sense? So essentially, that's what the Articles was. It was like a formalized version of the Articles of the First and Second Continental Congress. John Dickinson, the guy that walked out of 1776 at the end, he came back and he wrote the Articles. They were proposed in 1777 and they were ratified finally by the 13th state on in March of 1781. So the same year that the Revolutionary War ended, the Articles become official. Now, if you look at the first page of this note, let's quickly look at the prior history to the convention, and then I'm going to walk you very quickly through the dates and drama of the Constitutional Convention. So, after 1781 and the end of the war, the most critical thing, and this is, I think, dealt with in chapters 10 and 11 of Chernow, is the Treaty of Paris, the formal recognition of American independence. Now, one of the things that you have to understand is the British agreed to two things, which they never complied with. They agreed to evacuate all their forts in the Mississippi Valley up to the Mississippi River, and how many of you know what impressment was? There's a discussion of this in Chernow, but what was impressment?
The sailing ships.
Yeah, that's how the British Navy got their sailors, is they forcibly drafted people. And then they were continuing to do that. They promised not to do that anymore, and here's the point. All of the things that Britain agreed to do to in the Treaty of Paris, they never obeyed. And here's the point. What could we do about it? Zilch. Why? Because we had no money, we had no military power, we had no diplomatic power. The Articles was such a failure of government that on the national stage, on the international stage, and even on the internal stage, the country was rapidly falling apart. Now, the next major event to look at is Shays' Rebellion of 1786. That was probably the major crystallizing event that actually brought in mind the sense of the need for reform in the United States. And it's interesting, by the way, to see the way Shays' Rebellion, in which Daniel Shays was a former captain in the Army who was indebted, and like all farmers, because you understand the economy collapsed during and after the war, because we were essentially an agricultural nation, and guess who our main customer was for our products? Great Britain. So what happens when your whole market collapses? You get a supply chain problem. No, I'm just kidding. That's what we're having right now. So anyway, obviously, you had all these indebted farmers, and of course, banks and other financing institutions closed on the mortgages, and of course, Daniel Shays led a rebellion, but was quickly suppressed. It's interesting to see how historians now and then have a different take on this, and I don't want to judge the phase, but except to say this. The political elite of America saw that the political and social and economic fabric of the nation was rapidly falling apart. And so that leads to the events of the Constitutional Convention. I talked about, by the way, the Annapolis Convention on Friday, which both Madison and Hamilton, who were serving in the Congress under the Articles and saw the weaknesses of the system on both the national and the state level, they organized the Annapolis Convention in September of 1786. It failed because only 5 states attended, but they did manage to pass a resolution which asked Congress to call another convention. And what you have in the middle is the actual congressional resolution of February 21st, 1787. Resolved that in the opinion of Congress it is expedient that on the second Monday in May next, a convention of delegates shall have been appointed by the several states to be held at Philadelphia for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation and reporting to Congress and the several legislatures such alterations and provisions therein as shall, when agreed to in Congress and confirmed by the states, render the federal constitution adequate to the exigencies, which is a fancy word for necessities, of government and the preservation of the Union. Now, as I pointed out in my American government class when I go over this material, if you read this resolution, what would you take away as the primary purpose of the Constitutional Convention? And I'll direct you right to the phrase, whose sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. What would you have said the purpose of the Constitutional Convention was? Yeah, to fix the existing system. And as you're going to see, that's exactly what the convention did not do. Which explains, by the way, some of the tensions within it, and as you'll see, also Hamilton's role. We'll go over the Constitutional Convention in a minute, but then from 1787 to 88 was the ratification struggle. That is what we're going to turn to on Wednesday, because that's the second great role that Hamilton plays in the founding of the Constitution, the drafting of the remarkable 85 Federalist Papers. And more about that on Wednesday. So in 1788, on July 8th, the ninth state ratifies the Constitution goes into effect, and on March 4th, 1789, Congress meets and begins to govern. And by the way, that's what starts Act 3 of Hamilton's life, where he becomes Washington Secretary of Treasury and in effect becomes the first prime minister of the new government. And as you'll see, the elements in that, when we'll turn to the rest of this week and next week, are not only does the national government begin to unfold, but Hamilton has his footprint on everything. And it's only because of Hamilton's influence, in some ways, that the government under the Constitution survives, that the Constitution gets a hold in America, and that America goes from a debtor nation to actually a wealthy nation almost in 10 years. So that's the third act of Hamilton's life. The fourth act, by the way, is his retirement, self-destruction, and unhappiness, etc. So, all right, good. And then, of course, you could say the founding period is over with 1789 to 91, with the ratification of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. Now, so you can either follow along with my narrative there, or you can turn right to the remarkable chartograph. All right, let's walk through this. First of all, the convention was supposed to start out on the second Monday in May, which would have been May 14th or 15th. Nobody came on time. It's like Jewish Standard Time. You know, Jewish Standard Time, you just take the clock time and you add 20 minutes to an hour. Like my wedding was scheduled at 11:30 a.m., but we didn't start until 1:30. It's called Jewish Standard Time. So the colonies operated, the states operated on the table. But there was one delegation that was organized, and there, all 7 members of the Virginia delegation. James Madison. And he had done 2 remarkable things. He persuaded George Washington to attend as a member of the Virginia delegation. And as you're going to see, one of the first things the convention does is elect George Washington the president of the convention. Critical for the success of the Constitution. I don't think if the convention had not elected Washington, who at that point was probably the most beloved, and besides Franklin, the most popular American, I don't think the Constitution would have been adopted. It was the addition of Washington's brand name to the convention as president that I think actually pushed the Constitution in the minds of Americans over onto the acceptance stage. So the other thing that Madison did in that 2.5 weeks when the 7 members of the Virginia delegation were there is he drafted the Virginia plan. Now, I have sent the Virginia plan out to you. Now look, the convention opens finally on May 25th. They vote some rules of procedure, they elect Washington president. Then what's literally the next major thing that happens? Edmund Randolph from Virginia, also a member of the Virginia delegation, stands up and proposes the Virginia Plan. Now, when you look at the Virginia Plan, here's what it does not. It does not enlarge and revise the Articles of Confederation. It completely scraps them for a new system of government. And when you look at the Virginia Plan, you'll see it's a bicameral legislature, both based on population, which means it's no longer a confederation, it's a true nation. There are significant national powers of commerce regulation. Madison wanted the Congress to be able to negative the laws of every state and other features. So my point that I want you to take away from this is the very first plan that the convention discovered is not a revision of the Articles, it's a complete abandonment of them. And so for 2 weeks the convention debates this. But underneath it all, there begins to be a current of resentment for 2 reasons. So many of the delegates say this is not what we were here for. We're only here to fix the Articles, not abandon them. And the other thing is the confederal nature of the Union, in which each state had a single equal vote. Several of the delegates had express instructions from their legislatures not to vote for any plan which abandons the equality of the states. So the next critical date, June 15th. The New Jersey Plan. William Patterson, the governor of New Jersey, stands up and offers the second great plan. And when you look at the New Jersey Plan, what you see is this is a mere revision of the Articles. It's true it has a separation of powers. It has a plural executive, a committee, and it has some enforcement mechanism. But the New Jersey Plan, when you look at it, is essentially the Articles of Confederation. The next major date, June 18th. Alexander Hamilton. By the way, the convention met from about 10 in the morning till about 4 in the afternoon, about 6 hours. On that day, Hamilton rose to speak and was the only speaker and spoke straight for 6 hours. In it, he laid out his plan of government. And what I've asked you to do in your writing assignment is to look at his plan and look how radically different it is. Now, I won't go fully into it, but it's clear Hamilton's plan of government was so radical, so extreme, that nobody would have accepted it. Why did he spend 6 hours talking about it and proposing it? Because look at the next day. On the next day, the convention votes to vote down the New Jersey Plan and to vote up the Virginia Plan. Most historians believe, even though Hamilton probably believed in the principles of government that he was espousing, and you'll see the critical thing that Hamilton influences eventually is Article 2, the presidency. So even though Hamilton's plan is radical, he wanted a lifelong president. He wanted a lifelong Senate. What does that look like? The British Constitution sort of, doesn't it? So it's clear nobody would have accepted it, but yet Hamilton's influence on the final Constitution, especially on the presidency, is probably his greatest contribution. So on the next day, June 19th, the convention votes the New Jersey Plan down and votes the Virginia Plan up. And when I teach this in American government, I teach that the final Constitution is essentially a modified Virginia Plan with the addition of the strong presidency in Article 2, and then one other feature. Because after the small states lost that vote, did they go away? No. In fact, the convention almost fell apart. At one point, Madison, one of the organizers of the convention, wrote home to his wife, Dolly, please send some more Twinkies. No, he wrote, I'm so sick of this, I'm coming home. That is to say, right around July 4th, the convention almost fell apart until July 16th, the next major date, the Great Compromise, the Connecticut Compromise, the Sherman Compromise. And what is that? The House of Representatives remains elected by the people proportionately, but the Senate now is based upon the equal representation of the states. So, it's true, we have now a national government based on the American people, but it's not a pure national government. Because of that compromise, there are still confederal elements in our system of government. In other words, we're not a pure national system, we're not a pure confederation. Because of that day, we're kind of a mix. And that, by the way, that plays out in our political life even today. So, for the next couple of weeks, they debate the principles of the Virginia Plan, and on July 26th, they go out and play in the playground for recess. So the recess is from July 26th to August 6th, and the first great committee, the Committee on Detail, 11-person committee, takes all the debates that they've had so far and distills them into 22 resolutions, which are the ground of the Constitution. And then they resume on August 6th. For your information, what critical day is August 6th in later American history? World War II.
Hiroshima.
Yeah, that was the day that we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. And August 8th, which also is almost toward the convention apartment when we dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. What's August 8th? The issue of slavery suddenly raises its head again. And this is why there are 3 provisions in the Constitution, which you've had me for American government. You know, there are 3 provisions that refer to slavery but do not mention slavery. Article 1, Section 2, the 3/5 clause. Article 1, Section 9, the slave trade clause, and Article 4, Section 2, the fugitive slave clause. That was the second time when the convention almost split apart, but because of those compromises with slavery, the Constitutional Convention went on. By the time of August 31st, the last major division in the convention was how to elect the president, because now the president had become a powerful office. And most of the state legislatures in the initial proposals had Congress electing the president. But what's the problem with Congress electing the president given the separation of powers and the checks and balances? If the Congress elects the president, the Congress can control the president. And so the convention adopts the intermediate idea of an electoral college. From September 5th to 12th, and September 12th is my birthday, which I expect you all to remember that for the rest of your life, in check form, they create the second great committee, the Committee on Style. The Committee on Style is actually the committee that drafts the 7 articles of the Constitution. And guess who was a member of that one? Alexander Hamilton. And there's no doubt that almost all of the flexible clauses, especially in Article 2, are the result of Hamilton's influence in that committee. On September 16th, George Washington stepped down for the presidency, made one motion that the ratio of representation in the House should be from 1 to 40,000 to 1 to 30,000. He stepped back up. It was adopted unanimously. And then on the last day, September 17th, the Constitution was signed, and that is why we celebrate September 17th as Constitution Day. And by the way, one last thing. I always get teary about this because I'm profoundly attached to my country and to the remarkable founding, which in some ways changed the whole nature of human political history across the globe. And Benjamin Franklin, who was 81 at this time and died not short of this, couldn't talk, he had gout. And yet, as he was watching them sign, he says, as you could see, he says, I've often wondered, there's a sign, if you go to the Independence Hall, there's a portrait of a rising sun behind the president's chair. And he says, and by the way, he couldn't read this, but he whispered it, and Madison happened to be standing there, and he says, I've often wondered if it was a rising sun and a setting sun, and yet, after all these months of deliberation, I have the pleasure to know that the American Republic is a rising and not a setting sun.